regard to whatever the verdict would be. I was thinking about the jurors as well. I mean, there's people from all walks of life. You have three who are in their 20s, ranging in age. You have one woman who goes into her 60s, and six who identify as people of color, three of them black men. You have one who's a social worker, accountant, a chemist, a banker, a nurse. And we did get a lot of color during the jury selection about their thoughts on race and social justice and criminal justice. There was a white man who was very clear. He said, look, I believe all lives matter. You had a black man who said that when he had seen the video, he had told his wife that could have been me. And so going into this, they allowed these jurors that have these diverse opinions and backgrounds and experiences and perspectives. And then you had just a few days before before the trial culminated, the shooting, the fatal shooting of Daunte Wright, which the defense obviously wanted them to be sequestered and not hear that, but the judge allowed them to hear that, and so you have to wonder, were they at all impacted by that, and were they able to just focus on this as an isolated incident, or did they look at the historical injustice of all of this? Additionally, they knew about the $27 million settlement. This was the largest pretrial settlement in America's history for this kind of civil rights death. And so a lot going into what those jurors brought into this and what they thought as it all played out in real time.
We can hear the choppers overhead there in Minneapolis. Our thanks to Lindsay Davis, and we'll be checking back in with you over the course of this afternoon. These are live pictures on the ground there in South Minneapolis. Relative calm, as you can see, in this community and in so many communities across this country. I think people in their smartphones have heard that there is a verdict, the judge revealing that and saying that the verdict would be delivered in about an hour. That was a little more than an hour ago, so we are expecting that jury at any time. And Lindsay talking about the diversity of the members of that jury, and I know we have that graphic that actually breaks down members of the jury, if we have a moment to bring that back up, just to help folks at home understand that the jury selection was something that both sides so carefully spent time on in this case. Members of the jury, 5 men, 7 women, ages from 20 to 60 years old, 4 black jurors, 6 white jurors, and 2 jurors who self-identify as multiracial. One of the jurors, for example, a white woman in her 50s, she works as a nurse. She assured the court that even though she had seen a portion of that viral video, that the video of George Floyd on the ground, that she could be impartial. And she acknowledged that we all bring life experience to the jury if we are selected, and talked about how her background as a nurse could potentially help her make decisions in this case. I want to bring in Nightline anchor Byron Pitts, who's been covering this right along with us from the very beginning. And Byron, I mentioned this a moment ago in talking with Lindsay, the diversity of the faces of the families across this country who wanted justice after seeing that video themselves. And this has really been almost a year-long conversation in this country about how we move forward.
You're so right, David. And that's why this moment is so different from other moments in American history, where we've seen instances where Black America went one direction and white America seemed to go someplace else. In this particular moment, this case, the reaction seemed to be universal. People of all stripes reacted in a very passionate way to the death of George Floyd. And David, I'm struck by something that you said earlier, that this is a deep breath moment for our nation. I think you're absolutely right. You think about these kinds of trials. I was looking at that trial, the 4 police officers in Los Angeles in 1992, the O.J. Simpson trial in 1995. This day is one of those moments where many Americans will hold their breath to see what happens. And David, I think in many ways we may have 2 verdicts today. We will have the verdict of this jury, this diverse jury, and in the hours and days to come, we will have the verdict of the American people. One can imagine that, however it goes, a portion of America will see that justice will serve. A portion of America will say that justice missed its mark. And I think while we wait for this verdict, it'll also be curious to see, and I think that's why we see the law enforcement presence in Minneapolis and other major cities across this nation, as we all, David, as you said, hold our breath waiting for this verdict.
And of course, Byron, no one wants to get ahead of themselves as far as this verdict is concerned. We do know that the relatively short amount of time and the weight of this case, as we heard from Sunny Hostin earlier, signals that there was agreement, and fairly early on within that jury, The jury that was sequestered immediately after those closing arguments, immediately after getting instructions from the judge who asked them not to bring their bias into that decision making, but also not to worry or be concerned with how the country and the world would react to their decision, because after all, the live stream showed the rest of us what transpired in that courtroom, with the exception of the jurors themselves. We all got to watch, but we didn't see the folks who will actually make this decision, who were there from day one during this trial. I want to bring in Terry Austin from Law and Crime, the network that covers this. She's been covering this case, obviously, for the better part of the year. And Terry, I wanted to remind people at home, as we await this decision from the jury, what the prosecution was up against here. They had to convince beyond reasonable doubt that Derek Chauvin's actions, his knee to the neck, was a substantial cause of George Floyd's death. Not the only cause, but a substantial one.
That's exactly right. And I think the jury did boil it down to two issues. That issue that you just mentioned, the fact that there was unreasonable use of force, and that the substantial cause of the death was that unreasonable use of force. So they narrowed it down, and I think they came to a quick decision based on all of the evidence. And we had multiple witnesses who talked about this use of force. And of course, we had Chief Arredondo, who was pivotal in stating not only was this unreasonable use of force, but this was against policy and it was not showing the duty of care. The other issue that clearly the jury came to a very swift conclusion was the fact that the cause of death was the knee and it was unreasonable. And so they listened to all the medical evidence, they listened to all of the evidence from the police officers, they cut to the chase. I'm sure they did consider the different elements that the judge talked about as far as the second degree, third degree, and manslaughter. But I think they narrowed it down to what Jared Blackwell said on his rebuttal, which was this: use the 46th witness on the stand, which is your common sense. If you believe that, in fact, what you saw on this video was unreasonable force and that the knee on the back and the neck caused the death, then you have to come back with the guilty verdict. And I do believe that's exactly what they did.
Well, we'll wait and see for that, because we also know that the defense spent 3 hours yesterday in its closing argument from defense attorney Eric Nelson to try to sow doubt among that jury, continuing with what he had done over the course of the trial, bringing up past drug use of George Floyd, his heart condition, asking was there the potential of any carbon monoxide from that patrol car? Did bystanders distract Derek Chauvin while he was right there at that scene with his knee to George Floyd's neck for 9 minutes, 29 seconds? And the defense attorney tried to make the case that this particular trial is about more than those 9 minutes, that the jurors, when they deliberate, should be thinking about, as he said, the 60 minutes that came before and what Chauvin came upon when he arrived at that scene. He tried to use images of them putting George Floyd into the patrol car, 3 officers trying to do that to no avail, to try to make the case that those were all factors that Derek Chauvin took into account in those 9 minutes. Of course, then the rebuttal from the prosecution, making the point that over the course of those 9 minutes, he certainly had time to react to what he was presiding over during those 9 minutes. And direct reaction to the carbon monoxide suggestion, saying if that were in fact the case, the carbon monoxide was coming from the police patrol car, so he should have been aware of that too. So we saw a back and forth between the prosecution and the defense as they made their closing arguments yesterday. I want to bring in Kenneth Moton from Minneapolis. Kenneth was on the air with us yesterday as we were covering these closing arguments. I know that you have been in touch with George Floyd's family and his family's representation, Ben Crump and others, for their reaction to the prosecution's closing argument, and then the defense once we heard the 3 hours of their closing argument. I'm curious if you're hearing anything in the last 24 hours and to the development of this last hour.
David, they are gathered in a hotel here in downtown Minneapolis. The words we're hearing right now at this hour, they're optimistic. They are in good spirits, but they're also anxious, eager, nervous as we await this verdict here. Also, we know that when it comes to this Floyd family, that in the past 10, 11 months or so, since the death of George Floyd, this family has gone through a lot. Yes, they got a $27 million settlement, but they lost this loved one, this person they knew, who they watched in this video die at the knee of Derek Chauvin. And so for this family, they've gotten the good and the bad, David. They have gotten a lot of support, but they've also heard from the critics who believe that George Floyd should have resisted, that he was on drugs, that he was somehow at fault. But they've got a number of supporters, people who have been in these streets. And so Philonise Floyd, the brother of George Floyd, has said that he is urging for peace and calm after this verdict is read, but he knows that he can't control the anger on these streets for those people who are hitting the streets. And really, David, for this family, for months now, they have watched this country go through a racial reckoning. They've watched this country change, and many industries change because of this racial reckoning. But they truly feel that today, with this verdict, that today is their day of reckoning. David?
Kenneth Moulton in Minneapolis, and the family all along has asked for peace and calm across this country, something Terrence Floyd told me almost a year ago in Brooklyn, that they were deeply moved by the diversity of the faces in these protests across the country, but saying any sort of violence is not what their brother would have wanted. I want to bring in our senior national correspondent, Steve Osunsami, of course, following the case as well. And Steve, as you and I were on the air yesterday during these closing arguments, we heard the prosecution say this is not an anti-police prosecution, that this is the case of Derek Chauvin, one lone officer in this particular trial. We know other officers will come later, perhaps later this summer, but this case is about Derek Chauvin, they said. And what was fascinating in this trial, and somewhat rare, as you know, Steve, is that sort of blue wall came down. There were a number of police witnesses that they used to make this case, and they put up a graphic during their closing argument, the prosecution just showing just the significance of the number of police witnesses who came forward and said this action was not justified.
That's right, David. And chief among them was this officer's former boss. You had a prosecutor saying that this wasn't policing, this was murder, that this was a shocking abuse of authority, that you cannot justify what everyone saw in that videotape. And I want to share just a little bit of inside baseball. You know, Byron alluded to the Rodney King incident. You know, there are a lot of people saying that the only difference between what happened in the Rodney King incident, where those officers walked away, and what is happening here is the improved quality of the videotape. You know, this verdict could prove that line wrong, or it could underline it. So a lot of people, especially in Black America, are waiting to see, will this happen again?
I'm making
will
some
what
coffee.
we see with our own eyes be rejected by a jury? And I'll tell you some of the arguments that we were hearing from the defense in this case, that this was I call it the super black defense. You know, a big black man who was super strong and had some chemicals that were assisting him in his strength. You know, we've heard many of those arguments before in some of these other cases. The Walter Scott case in South Carolina, people forget that was another case where you saw a police officer shoot a black man in the back. It was on camera, and that officer was not acquitted in state court. And in fact, when we polled the jury, you know, we expected there was probably one holdout, and that's what the defense in this case was hoping for, just one. But in that case, there were two, and one of the holdouts was African American. So you just never know what you're going to get from these cases, what the jury is hearing, how they process the information. And you know, one thing I want to underline that the prosecution, as you pointed out, was very big about was they wanted to make sure that this wasn't an anti-police case. They wanted to underline to any jurors out there that this isn't about punishing cops. This is about punishing a bad cop. And that was the message that they were really trying to underline, and that we'll see if it has gotten across to the jurors in this case.
It's so important to point out, Steve, that we simply do not know what this jury has decided. All we do know is that they have come to a verdict in a relatively short amount of time. As Steve mentioned there, the defense, what they try to do is, of course, sow some doubt in the mind of at least one juror to hold up the verdict, to get them to deliberate even longer, to get one of the jurors to make other jurors question in that deliberation room. But that does not appear to be the case, obviously, in this trial. To reach a verdict of guilty or not guilty, all 12 jurors need to agree on a charge. And that is what we have here. We simply don't know what their decision is in this case. And I want to bring in Terry Moran, because Terry, we were talking there with Byron and with Steve, and and Lindsay a little earlier about the diversity of faces, the wide swath of Americans. It sort of was the fabric of America that we watched over the course of the last year. People who looked at that video and then had to have that conversation with their children at home. Children, and we saw the 9-year-old witness in this case who said she heard paramedics say, "Get off of him." Children often know when they look at an image, at least, what they believe is right or wrong.
They do, David, and prosecutor Jerry Blackwell used the testimony of that 9-year-old girl, a minor witness not identified by name in this trial, to make the case to the jury. She got it right. And it's the feeling that we all had when my own then 7-year-old daughter asked my wife what had happened. She'd heard something about it, and my wife had explained it to her. She burst into tears. And that's the wisdom of a 7-year-old, too. And I think one of the things, having covered trials where police officers are on trial in the past, our country has, as we know, a bad history in many ways with these. Something felt different to me in this one. The first eyewitnesses, the bystander eyewitnesses, that 9-year-old girl, her cousin Darnella Frazier, who took the videotape. Charles McMillan, who was the elder, the mayor of that community, who took the witness stand and burst into tears. The whole world saw that video. They saw the event. And they brought us even closer to that experience of horror that we all had in watching that. The other thing that felt different, the thin blue line shattered. In this case, the chief of police, Medaria Arredondo of Minneapolis, took the stand against his former officer. So did other officers in that department. Took the witness stand and testified for the prosecution against Derek Chauvin, a police officer, an expert witness from the Los Angeles Police Department, came across the country. Lawyers I talked to said they'd never seen anything like it. So there was something different in this trial. The reckoning of the uprising that happened in our streets, I think, was felt in that courtroom, and not in an illegitimate way, in a true way.
Terry, stick with us here as we look at live pictures from Minneapolis, the people of that community, and really across this country now. So many have had the chance to be alerted through social media or on their phone that the verdict has been reached, one of those very rare moments in this country, as I mentioned earlier, when people will come to the TV or wherever they can get their information to find out what the decision will be from these jurors. But Terry, you bring up a good point. There was something about this trial, a number of things that were different from what we've seen in the past. But one of the things that was I took note of was the fact that both sides tried to make bias an issue. We heard from the prosecution about the bias that we're all raised to believe that police officers, and the vast majority of them do, try to protect and serve their community, but that we should not think about police as a whole, but about this specific officer. That was what the prosecution said to the jurors as they were prepared to go in and then deliberate his fate. On the flip side of that, we heard in the closing argument yesterday that the defense attorney for Derek Chauvin saying, don't be biased with everything that they have presented in this case. You must keep in mind what Derek Chauvin saw and heard when the dispatch call first came in, what he saw when he arrived on the scene in those 16 minutes before those crucial 9 minutes that the country and the world saw. But he tried to make the case you must think about the information that he gathered in his head in the 16 minutes prior. And he tried to introduce the bystanders, the witnesses, as a form of distraction. And at some points, he tried to make the case that there was a potential danger from people there in the community. Those two very different arguments over bias, and I'm curious if it struck you and which argument carried greater weight.
It did, and I think you're exactly right on what the defense was trying to do there. In South Chicago, 38th in Minneapolis, 38th in Chicago and Minneapolis, very diverse neighborhood, trying to communicate to the jurors, well, Derek Chauvin had a legitimate concern because, there were people from that neighborhood on the street. But the problem was we heard from them. The jurors heard from them, and they saw the picture of them, and they heard what they were trying to do. They were trying to stop what they thought was an atrocity. And I think one of the things that the defense had such a hard problem with is that I think every decent American, every patriotic American recognizes that we have had a problem in this country. We've had a problem with the use of force against black bodies and black people. And that's not to say that a person like Derek Chauvin can't get a fair trial. It is to understand that the history here, has resulted in bad verdicts, and the jury has that history in their hearts, as we all do. And that, I think, is how they're going to address those claims of bias on both sides. Their job is to look at the evidence against this man and the law in this case. But they speak for the community, for their local community, and for all of us.
Terry Moran with us from our Washington Bureau. Terry, thank you. As we continue to look at pictures, these are the aerial pictures, of course, from Minneapolis coming in. There's also pictures from South Minneapolis, right in front of the Cup Foods, the scene of horror, really, witnessed by the entire world because of the video that was captured that day. And you can see the vigil there for George Floyd, the images of George Floyd and people gathering. Very calm scenes across this country, as we have mentioned here. No one wants to get ahead of themselves. We have no idea what the jury has decided. All we know at this point, for those of you just joining us for our live coverage, 5 p.m. Eastern, is that the judge in this case, Judge Cahill in Minneapolis, has revealed that the jurors have reached a verdict in the trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin, who has been charged with 3 charges, as we know, in the death of George Floyd. We will learn from the jury momentarily. He said in about an hour. That would have been about 30 minutes ago, but we do know that they were sequestered in a hotel in Minneapolis. You have to factor in the idea that they would be brought, and there's high security in this case, to the Hennepin County courtroom, several floors up in that office building in downtown Minneapolis, where we have seen the fencing and the significant presence of the National Guard, though luckily, and we have not seen any reason for that security up until this point. And of course, everyone waiting to hear what the jury has decided in this case. I want to bring in Deborah Roberts, ABC's Deborah Roberts, a mom, first and foremost, and a veteran correspondent here. But Deborah, you were telling us that it's a conversation that you had in your family with your children just in the last 24 hours about how the country, how the world might react to this.
That's right, David. And I'd have to tell you, when you all alluded to the videotape, as Steve Osunsami talked about, that was so much clearer and so much more impactful this time. Yesterday, watching those closing arguments and seeing so much of that excruciating videotape just sort of, I think, took us all back to last summer when this case just struck everybody. And if you have blood running through your veins, there's just no way you weren't impacted by that videotape. And just hearing those cries of George Floyd calling for his mother, I mean, there was something that was so primal and so difficult about that. And I did interviews last year with moms talking about how that affected them. And of course, so many of us having conversations, as Terry said, with our children. And I had a conversation with my own 18-year-old son about it. And I have to tell you, it was emotional for me hearing him talk about how fearful he was after seeing something like that. And even right now, he can't even look at it. He turns away from this tape, seeing this man's final minutes on this earth. So I think there's something about that tape that just struck at everyone. And I think while we all know that, you can't predict a jury, and there are going to be people, as Terry said, who may feel like the jury got it wrong, there just seems to be sort of this united feeling in this country that there was something so terribly wrong that went on last year. And I think that people are just waiting. I mean, someone just posted on social media, I'm sick to my stomach waiting for this verdict. I think for so many people, this is the culmination of just an awful, awful event that we have had to witness as people, with our children, as parents. And it has been something that has been very, very difficult. And I think that the weight of this verdict is sort of in play right here for so many of us who are dealing with this as parents, as well as just people who are watching what's going to happen. So you can't, I think, overstate the anxiety and the nervousness that people are feeling as they're waiting to see this come to a conclusion.
And Deborah, we of course have to remember that there is another family watching all of this all over again, and that's the family of George Floyd. And Deborah, I'm curious, a year later, with the context of all of the reporting now, that 9-minute video spoke volumes just by what we saw in the video, but given the context of the reporting and then what we've watched, because there was a live stream of the trial. So the country, the world watching, both sides make their cases, and with that additional context and with the very emotional testimony of those bystanders. I mean, we met just about everybody standing on that sidewalk just by watching this trial, and you have to wonder, and we'll learn which way the jury decides here in just a short time from now, but you have to wonder the impact of playing that video in the courtroom not just for the family of George Floyd, it must have been excruciating to go through this all over again, but in those closing arguments, the decision by the prosecution, they went much shorter with the video than they did in the opening statement. On the flip side, the defense used quite a bit of the video with George Floyd on the ground, and I'll be curious to see what jurors decide from watching that video. In many ways, it was more difficult the second time around. And Judge Cahill now in the courtroom. Deborah, stand by. Our entire team standing by.
Damn it!
All right, for the jury. All right, please be seated. Members of the jury, I understand you have a verdict. Members of the jury, I will now read the verdicts as they will appear in the permanent records of the 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota, County of Hennepin, District Court, 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota Plaintiff versus Derek Michael Chauvin, Defendant. Verdict, Count 1. Court file number 27, CR 20-12646. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to Count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April, 2021 at 1:44 p.m. Signed, juror foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 2. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 2, third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April, 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Signed by jury foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 3. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April, 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Jury foreperson 019. Members of the jury, I'm now going to ask you individually if these are your true and correct verdicts. Please respond yes or no. Juror number 2, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 9, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 19, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 27, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 44, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 52, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 55, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 79, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 85, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 89, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 91, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Juror number 92, are these your true and correct verdicts?
Yes.
Are these your verdicts, so say you one, so say you all?
Yes.
Members of the jury, I find that the verdicts as read reflect the will of the jury and will be filed accordingly. I have to thank you on behalf of the people of the state of Minnesota for not only jury service, but heavy-duty jury service. What I'm going to ask you to do now is to follow the deputy back into your usual room, and I will join you in a few minutes to answer your questions and to advise you further. So, all rise for the jury. All right, be seated. With the guilty verdicts returned, we're going to have Blakely, you may file a written argument as to Blakely factors within 1 week.
the court will issue findings on the Blakely factors, the factual findings. 1 week after that, we'll order a PSI immediately, returnable in 4 weeks. And we will also have a briefing on, after you get the PSI, 6 weeks from now, and then 8 weeks from now, we will have sentencing. We'll get you the exact dates in a scheduling order. Is there a motion on behalf of the state?
They move to have the court revoke the defendant's bail and remand him into custody, pending sentencing.
Bail is revoked, bond is discharged, and the defendant is remanded to the custody of the Hampton County Sheriff. Anything further?
All right.
All right. Thank you.
So there you have it. The jury in Hennepin County in Minneapolis finding Derek Chauvin guilty on all 3 counts: second-degree unintentional murder, third-degree murder, and second-degree manslaughter. Guilty in all 3. You can see him being led away there in the courtroom. He had been out on bail. You heard the state request of the judge that bail be revoked and that he be taken into custody, which is exactly what the judge decided to do. You can see the counts up on your screen right now. The jury deliberating yesterday afternoon and then began deliberating again early this morning, but it was a short period of time before we learned that they had come to a unanimous conclusion. Clearly, they thought that the case made by the prosecution and perhaps that final closing argument, that rebuttal from Jerry Blackwell when he said to the jury, it's as simple as what that 9-year-old girl, one of the bystanders, said that she heard the paramedics say when they arrived there more than 9 minutes after that knee was put to George Floyd's neck. She said that she heard paramedics say, get off of him. Of course, in the hours and the days to come, we will learn more from that jury, what they were thinking over the course of this 3-week trial. But we want to look at the reaction coming in from Minneapolis. This was the scene in South Minneapolis just moments ago. They had described the sound of people gathering there, obviously erupting. Embracing one another, and in many ways for that community and for the people who have gathered there, it has been an extraordinarily long year in this country. This is the scene again, George Floyd Square. From the family, George Floyd's family, through their legal team, Ben Crump, we know, leading that team, clearly overjoyed. They believe justice has been served in this case. Derek Chauvin found guilty on all counts. And I want to bring in our chief legal analyst, Ann Abrams, as we look at these images. Clearly, the pause there is in between each count as the judge was reading from that piece of paper delivered to him by the foreperson of the jury. And Dan, guilty on all counts. They believe the prosecution made its case beyond a reasonable doubt.
Yep, on each and every charge. And remember that there are slightly different theories with regard to second-degree murder and third-degree murder. I mean, there was a possibility that he could be found guilty of second-degree murder, not of third-degree murder, and then guilty of second-degree manslaughter. That didn't happen. This was a prosecution clean sweep here. And now Derek Chauvin will be sentenced on the highest charge, which is second-degree murder, faces up to 40 years. The sentencing guidelines in Michigan suggest more likely 10 to 15 years. But I'll tell you, David, you mentioned that 9-year-old girl, and she could be relevant in the context of sentencing because prosecutors can ask for what's called an enhancement in the sentencing, meaning to go beyond what the guidelines would suggest because a child was present. And so that 9-year-old girl was not just an emotional witness, but she could become a very important witness with regard to the potential sentence that Derek Chauvin gets. You heard him, the judge then referring to the Blakely standard, and that means basically start preparing for the argument over sentencing. And that will be the next phase of this case to determine what the sentence for Derek Chauvin will be. But at this point, certainly a big win for the prosecution in this case, getting everything that they asked this jury for.
Just to drill down on that point, Dan, as for Minnesota state law, the jury will decide, the judge will decide sentencing on the highest of the charges, which of course is unintentional second-degree murder. The presumed sentence is usually 10 to 15 years, but he faces up to 40 years. And as you mentioned, the state will ask for what's called an aggravated sentence here, and he could face decades behind bars.
Absolutely. And, I think that is going to be, really the next big debate in this case over exactly what should be the sentence for Derek Chauvin. Again, as we talked about when the jury reached its verdict and we said they came back so quickly, this is not good news for Derek Chauvin. Again, on the sentencing side, I wouldn't want to be Derek Chauvin either, meaning that, typically, and it's not just typically, it's really the vast majority of cases where you're talking about second-degree murder or third-degree murder. You are talking about up to 15 years. But in this case, based on a number of factors, I expect the prosecution to ask for more time, and the judge will have to determine that. And David, I want to just add one other quick point, which is about the diversity of this jury. And I think it's important because we often talk about diversity and it sounds like a concept as opposed to something that can actually instill a sense of confidence in people about a verdict. The fact that there were 4 people who were African American on that jury, there were 2 who described themselves as multiracial, 6 whites, and they all came together and very quickly agreed on this verdict. This was a jury of peers, and as a result, I think that that's helpful in instilling confidence in the verdict for the community at large.
And Sonny Hostin, as we look at these images coming in from across the country, but first, of course, from Minneapolis, relief in that community. And you yourself said, as a former prosecutor yourself, when you heard that there was a verdict and this quickly, that even you had thought there would be at least questions from perhaps the jurors for the judge, and there was not. Unanimous, guilty on all charges.
David, I've been a lawyer for 27 years, and I remember when I was in law school during my first year, the Rodney King verdict came out, and it was an acquittal for 4 officers who, on video, beat and stomped and tased beat a man 56 times with a baton. And I believed my eyes then. So I believed my eyes this time with George Floyd. And even though I knew that fast verdicts always hint at an agreement, even though all of my training told me that they likely convicted on at least the highest count or at least the lowest count, because of the history in this country, because it is so rare that police officers are convicted, because Black men and Black boys are killed by police with impunity in this country, and that is just the truth, at a rate 5 times more than their white counterparts. Because I am the mother of an 18-year-old boy who is now in South Africa, and I feel that he is safer in South Africa than he is in his own country. I am so relieved that this is what justice finally looks like for my community. And while I know that this does not bring George Floyd back to his family, to his loved ones, to his brother who we've heard from so eloquently, at least I believe now that the movement that we've seen since his murder on video for the world to see is not just a moment. I really believe that this is a movement that we've seen. And for that, I am so very thankful that perhaps we will see real change, much needed change in this country.
Sonny Hostin with some very personal reflections on our coverage this afternoon and the guilty verdict from the jury in Minneapolis. Sonny, thank you. And when you couple what Sonny said and her observations along with what Dan Abrams said just moments before her, that perhaps this could be a unifying moment when you think about the jury and the diversity, the makeup of that jury. 6 white jurors, 6 people of color, 4 black jurors, and 2 they self-identify as multiracial, but they all deliberated together, and in just a short period of time were united on what they saw when they watched those 9 minutes and what they heard over the course of 3 weeks inside that Minneapolis courtroom. You can see they have begun to put up signs in Minneapolis. That's the scene from South Minneapolis. Justice served is what that sign says underneath George Floyd's name now. They've now put that up on the sign. And my colleague, Lindsay Davis, is in Minneapolis. And Lindsay, the reaction there.
David, you know, there was a novel by Terry McMillan, subsequently a movie called Waiting to Exhale. Today it was so much more than that. That was All of Us. And just a little while ago, I was telling you about how the streets here were empty. You hardly saw any people or cars. Well, suddenly now you hear just the celebratory honking. I saw a small group of black people walk by who chanted Black Lives Matter. And certainly, you know, this verdict doesn't change our criminal justice system, but perhaps for some, at least for this day, if nothing more beyond that, it does send this message. And for those who consider this to be a win or a victory, perhaps they owe a debt to Darnell Frazier, the 17-year-old who shot that video, because so much was made of the prosecution's saying, but for the knee, right? And I imagine many today are saying, but for the videotape, would we find ourselves in this place today? After all, if we go back to how this started, all with a counterfeit $20 bill, a crime that Chief Arellano testified that normally they wouldn't even take somebody into custody for. So much jubilation really on the streets here.
Lindsay Davis on the ground in Minneapolis for us as we continue our live coverage of the verdict in the trial of former Minneapolis police officer Derek Chauvin. He was a veteran with the police force there in Minneapolis, a 19-year veteran, 45 years old. He's been found guilty of second-degree unintentional murder, guilty of third-degree murder, guilty of second-degree manslaughter. We're getting some color from inside that courtroom, and of course the live stream offers the country and the world a perspective that we would not have seen had we not been in this pandemic. The judge saying he was doing this live stream because the community would not be allowed to come into the courtroom and witness at this trial as it unfolded. But some of what we can't see in that courtroom has just come in. And this is from the print reporter who was inside the courtroom. They're allowing a reporter or two inside that courtroom every day, but because of restrictions, just a small number of reporters. They described the scene as the judge said, all rise. The jurors entering that courtroom, we are told all of them looked serious. None of them looked emotional, or that they had been teary, or that there had been emotions exchanged while they were deliberating. All of them, in this note that we've been given by the print reporter who was in the room, serious as they walked into the courtroom. Judge Cahill reading the verdicts on that paper as Chauvin stared at the empty witness podium. And as you saw at home, as we were carrying this live, this is the era that we're in, the face mask. There was very little reaction unless you're reading the eyes of Derek Chauvin. And I do believe we have video of the actual moment. You won't be able to see much, but here's what we saw.
The permanent records of the 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota, County of Hennepin, District Court, 4th Judicial District. State of Minnesota plaintiff versus Derek Michael Chauvin, defendant. Verdict, count 1. Court file number 27, CR 20-12646. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 1, unintentional second-degree murder while committing a felony, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April, 2021 at 1:44 p.m. Signed, juror foreperson, juror number 19.
And that's the reaction of Derek Chauvin as he went through each of the counts.
Entitled matter as to count
As
2,
you can see,
third-degree murder, perpetrating an eminently dangerous act, find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April, 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Signed by jury foreperson, juror number 19. Same caption, verdict count 3. We, the jury, in the above entitled matter as to count 3, second-degree manslaughter, culpable negligence, creating an unreasonable risk. Find the defendant guilty. This verdict agreed to this 20th day of April 2021 at 1:45 p.m. Jury foreperson 019. Members of the jury, I'm now going to ask you
Derek Chauvin, his reaction inside that courtroom, of course wearing a mask, which makes it very difficult
Jury number 2 are
for anyone to truly judge at home what the reaction was. Though it seemed rather stoic, calm, and as he was led away from the courtroom, no resistance, and that was in the note that he stood up. That certainly his defense attorney prepared him for the very likely scenario that if he was found guilty, that the state would ask the judge to revoke bail, which is exactly what they did. And of course, given his background in law enforcement, he knew that was very likely what would happen if found guilty on really any of the charges. Those are the descriptions from inside the courtroom, and of course we'll learn more in the hours and the days to come. One of the things that we were struck by today is that even before this verdict was delivered by this jury in Minneapolis, we heard from President Biden at the White House weighing in on this case, and he said he was only weighing in, offering what he did, because he knew that the jurors in this case had been sequestered and would not hear what the president was saying. The White House revealing today that he did call the family of George Floyd in the last 24 hours. And I want to bring in our chief White House correspondent, Cecilia Vega, because Cecilia, you were telling me just before we came on this afternoon that we were actually expecting to hear from President Biden, but that was put on hold, and we obviously assumed it was because the White House knew this was coming, not what verdict was coming, but that there was a significant development and that we would soon learn it.
And David, I know from speaking with sources over the last few weeks in the lead up to this moment that we are in as a country, that they've been trying to figure out the right way to have the president speak out and address the nation. I expect that we will hear from him at some point soon. We do know from colleagues that here in the White House, who are inside the White House right now, that we've seen people. Are we going to hear from him? Is that what you're telling me? Okay, not yet. But we have seen preparations, staffers at a podium, so we do expect to hear from him. I would not be surprised. We know, David, that the president has been watching this trial very closely, and that he has developed a relationship with the family of George Floyd. You mentioned that he spoke to his brother today, and the press secretary told us earlier this afternoon that this is, of course, a president who knows intimately what it means to live with grief, and he has that connection with the family of George Floyd, and that the president himself has said that he developed a connection with them. But he did make these controversial comments earlier this morning when the president said that he believed that the evidence against Chauvin was overwhelming and that he was.
I know there's no picture.
Right,
it's on my TV, not my computer, so it's hard to hold up.
When they were pushed on what that right verdict meant, but David, we know what President Biden has said all along, that he believes that George Floyd was murdered, that he believed he suffered at the hands of brutality in his death. So we also know, though, that we heard that warning from the judge in the courtroom, Judge Cahill, just yesterday, that he warned politicians against making statements on this case for fear that it would taint the jury, even though they are sequestered. The president and the White House have said that he would not have made this statement like this if they were not, in fact, the jury was not sequestered. So they tried to sort of back away from that. But we have heard from defense attorneys in many cases that they believe that it isn't appropriate for politicians to comment and weigh in ahead of jury verdicts for fear that they could end up being part of an appeal.
I have to blow my nose. I'm going to mute you for a second.
To hear from a president the country collectively that is not lost on this White House, that is not lost on this president, not just what the jury, not just what everybody in that courtroom went through, not just what the people of Minneapolis and that community and the family are going through, but what this country is going through. And just think back to the campaign. This is a man who campaigned on racial reckoning, who said he got into this race because of what happened in Charlottesville under President Trump. He was propelled in part, large part, into office by the help of African American voters in this country. That is how he won the nomination. So he feels the weight of this moment and this cultural reckoning that we are in. But David, there is also a political side to this as well. He promised police reform. He promised action on police reform on day one, and that has yet to happen. Instead, he is not backing a police commission that he said he would, a study commission. He is instead hoping on action on Capitol Hill that is stalled right now, David.
Cecilia Vega, monitoring developments from the White House. If and when we hear from President Biden, we will go right back to Cecilia. I should mention that many of our stations in the East might be joining their local news broadcasts, but we will continue until 6 p.m. Eastern. So should we hear from the president, we will bring that to you live. We will also bring you the Minnesota Attorney General, Keith Ellison, should he speak before we go off the air at 6 for local news here in the East, and then I'll be back on at 6:30 with our entire team. I wanted to bring in our senior national correspondent, Steve Osunsama. You heard Cecilia talk about the campaign, and we cannot forget that this all played out not only during the pandemic, but in the middle of a presidential campaign and one of the most, if not the most, highly charged campaigns of modern American history. And as Cecilia pointed out, this was something that President Biden did not shy away from. He talked about this reckoning in America, this conversation in America, and he said it was a conversation that was long overdue, Steve.
It's frankly one of the reasons why Joe Biden was able to get so many votes here in Georgia, because of that issue. That racial reckoning that happened after this incident not only affected our political world, it affected our workplaces, it affected our interpersonal relationships. And, I want to underline something here. You're seeing a lot of pictures of people celebrating, fist pumping, jumping in the air. But I want to underline that the thing that they're celebrating isn't the defeat of a police officer. It's the acknowledgement that in this incident, a black life that many Americans felt wasn't going to get its proper respect and due.
Damn it! Sorry, you guys. I'm having some problems.
Sided with what was justice.
Jesus.
Actually determined that what you saw, that the sky was blue, yes, indeed, the sky was blue. That's what I think people are celebrating in the streets, and what you're going to hear people celebrating. And, as much as the jury, we all expected, of course, the jury to come back and have its say. We knew that America was going to have its say as well. The streets were going to react to this. And the streets are reacting right now with a sense of relief, with a sense of justice, with a sense of equality achieved. Because so many of these cases, David, you and I have reported on many of these incidents where there was video, where it seemed as clear as day, and because of people's feelings about police officers, the officer was not acquitted, or it was a hung jury. That didn't happen in this case. You're hearing people chant Black Lives Matter, because that's really what this was all about. That was the heart of it. David?
Steve Osunsama, who covered the presidential campaign, and who covered it from a local level right there in Georgia, and the wide impact that state had, the voters in that state, their voices, shifting power in Washington on a number of levels. I want to bring in Ken Moten, who's reporting from Minneapolis for us. And Ken, you learned of late developments involving George Floyd's family.
The moment Flonus Floyd, George Floyd's younger brother, walked out of that courtroom, we understand he got a call from President Biden. In fact, we just watched a live stream, a social media live stream, David, from one of the family attorneys, where President Biden was essentially congratulating George Floyd's family, also a family attorney, Ben Crump, and even referenced what George Floyd's daughter said last summer, that her daddy changed the world, is going to change the world. And so that was a personal conversation that you had. It was on a social media live stream. And we understand, yes, President Biden has reached out to the family. Flonus Floyd actually spoke to the president before the verdict as well. We know that when it comes to President Biden, he has suffered tremendous loss from that viewpoint, from that aspect, and it was words of comfort to the family as well. But when it comes to inside that courtroom, David, we're hearing also that Philonise Floyd was inside. He was the family member who was inside. There's been at least one family member inside that courtroom every single day over the course of this trial. And as Philonise Floyd heard that verdict, guilty, 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 he had his hands clasped over his head, and he became shakier and shakier as he heard each count there, guilty. Also, family members are gathered inside a hotel here in downtown Minneapolis. Tears of joy, David, is what we understand, chanting George Floyd's name, just like the demonstrators on these streets, chanting that name over and over again, also saying it's an unbelievable feeling in that room. You mentioned Terrence Floyd, David, that you interviewed last summer. He said he was nervous, angry, but there's this relief that he feels right now. And when it comes to Chauvin being taken away in handcuffs, the family was chanting, yes, that's right, take him away. This is the moment they've been waiting for so long. They've gotten a big settlement. They've gotten a lot of support from the family, but this is what they were waiting for. And now as we await to hear from the family within the next few minutes or so, David, we understand they're going on to the next chapter of making sure they take this to the next level when it comes to legislation and police reform. David.
Next steps from the family, pushing for new legislation, and as Kenneth Moton just reported, police reform. But perhaps the biggest headline on Ken Moton's reporting there in Minneapolis is that President Biden called George Floyd's family in the moments after this verdict was delivered in that courtroom, guilty on all counts. And we remember when we were broadcasting World News Tonight from Houston on the eve of